Deirdre, can I start this off by asking you how I can use dreams to finish my novel more quickly and without anxiety?
In general, people definitely have some spontaneous breakthrough creative dreams without particularly trying. Anything that we're thinking about a lot awake is likely to show up in our dreams. But if you especially want to ask for help, it does seem to make it much more likely on a given night that you'll dream about a particular thing if you go to sleep reminding yourself that I'm stuck on this, I want to dream this scene, or I want this character to become more real, or I want to dream my ending, I'm not happy with my ending. And just tell yourself that, and if there's a visual image, if you already have an image of the scene that goes right before what you're trying to write, or an image of the character that's not quite clear enough, to just self-suggest as you're falling asleep, asking explicitly for a dream about this, makes it much, much likelier. In one of my studies, I found that about half of people who tried that for 1 week had some dream on their requested topic, and about a third had one that they really felt like kind of solved it or made some breakthrough.
You know, I tried your technique because, and I read about this in the Committee of Sleep, and one of the things that happened last week that surprised me is that, you know, here I was trying to figure out how you go in the narrative from one scene to this jump, and I needed to have it connected. So I thought, well, how do I get from this piece I already have, and this part here, which is, my goal was to get there. So I went and I had a dream about it, and the dream told me, well, don't start this way and go linearly, go from this part that you like, and then go back this way and revise that beginning to what you want. So it was, you know, it was really helpful, as you said, to do the problem solving with a set idea in mind. But last night, all my dreams were just total anxiety. So I don't think I had any creative ideas about that.
But I know that you've spontaneously, when you weren't specifically trying that, had some really dramatic literary dreams, and they're not in the Committee of Sleep because I met you shortly after that book came out. But I know you've told me some stories, and I doubt I've heard all of them, but one whole book kind of started with a dream, the cat one?
Yes, that one, I wrote this book, The Chinese Siamese Cat, and I feel that a lot of these dreams do have emotional content as a starting point. And my cat was dying at that time. She was 17 years old. She was diagnosed with something. And I was very, very sad. And I was remembering her as a kitten. And I had a dream that night. And I think it was based on this sadness of knowing her as a kitten, watching her grow up and get these colors. And so the story was about how Sagwa got her colors. And it involved her dipping her paws into ink and writing, and that she was in this very old place in China, and that she would write things out and change what was happening in the world. And it sort of went on, you know, about her mischievousness. So it wasn't complete in all the details, but the basic storyline was there. And it was originally, I think, based in emotion. So I don't have.
And you wrote a book from that, and they made TV
they made
series
a TV,
or film
yeah,
or
they made a TV
yeah,
series, but I didn't dream the TV series. Although, you know, I get story ideas very, very quickly if I don't think about it, and I just write them down very, very quickly. And I think I've done this before with dreams, and I was telling you about this, where I write them down, and I think it's a really important thing to do. I wrote down some of the dreams I had last night, and then I started reading them, and I don't remember them at all. So if I had not written them down, I would not have remembered what I had written. I was trying to figure out, when we were going to talk about this, what we mean by creativity, and thus how that figures into dreams.
Well, I think people mean so many different things by creativity. There's a lot of formal research in psychology on creativity. A number of different psychologists have made up creativity scales, paper and pencil measures, or sort of ways of rating creativity, and they only correlate modestly with each other. It's not like they're totally unrelated, but they're not, you know, if you score high on one creativity score, you're just a little likelier than average to score high on another. And I think that reflects probably what most other people really use the word for, that sometimes we're talking about artistic quality of something someone produces, sometimes we're talking about just kind of quirky, playful, personality kinds of, you know, just thinking a little bit less rigidly than other people. Scientists usually mean a kind of an insight into a kind of objectively verifiable right answer that they feel can be a very creative process of getting to something that's objectively out there. So we mean so many different things, and I think dreams actually have some role in aiding all of those, that just because they do get away from our most logical, linear, verbal style of thought awake, and they're so different that for any of those meanings of creativity, maybe most obviously for visual arts, because there's just so much fantastic, beautiful imagery in everyone's dreams, whether you have the skill to wake up and paint it or not, you've got art happening in your dreams. But really, I think all of those meanings of creativity are a little more related to dreams.
I was thinking about an intuitive sense of creativity, and people say, well, are you more creative, or how do you get your imagination? And I've never thought, well, I've never lived in your mind, so I don't know what the difference is exactly. But when people started pointing out things that I would say or do as being creative, I realized that a lot of it had to do with metaphor and kind of a quality of sensory imagery. And when people think of imagery, they think of it just as visual. But I think of it as all the senses. So it could be sense of smell, sense of, you know, all linked into one. And that with dreams, for me, it has a similar quality of these elements that somehow just come together, and that it's not random. It seems to have a cohesiveness. And what I find also is that in creativity, those leaps just happen really quickly, and I don't have to work at them. The metaphors happen, the associations happen. And I think that's why, for me, intuitively, dreams seem to be very similar to the creative aspects of that. Things just come together, the associations happen, and that it's a combination of memory and emotion and experiences and problem solving, although I don't consciously think of problem solving, but that also happens in there. No.
Yeah, I mean, we now know a lot about what the brain is doing during dreaming. Most dreams are happening in rapid eye movement sleep, a stage of sleep that we cycle through about every 90 minutes. And in that state, our brain wakes up and is actually slightly more active even than awake on average, but different areas are more or less active than when we're awake. And the visual cortex is more active yet than when we're awake. Whereas there's some other areas like the prefrontal cortex, which is right behind our foreheads, which is where we sort of judge social appropriateness and, you know, whether no, don't do that kinds of, both the Freudian censorship sort of idea, but also the just, no, that doesn't make sense, no, that's not the way to do it, is kind of all coming from here. And that area is much less active. You'll see the fallacy sometimes that the prefrontal is shut down during dreams, and that's not really true. It's still active, but it's
the buffers are a little down, and you can just...
Every part of your brain is doing something during dreaming, but some's ramped up and some's damped down. So that area that would kind of say, no, that's not the way to do it, is much quieter, and the one that's generating all these 3D visual images is much more active. The emotional areas are a little more active. So we're thinking in this very different biochemical state. And it's less likely to censor, no, don't do that, which is, I think, when some of the scientific breakthroughs have been made in dreams, that they almost always involve a scientist who's stuck on something because the conventional approach to the problem in this case happens to be wrong. The most famous example that gets cited all the time is Kekulé figuring out the structure of benzene when all known molecules were a straight line, and he knew the atoms in benzene and was trying to figure out some straight line with side chains. He fell asleep and saw the atoms dancing around in front of him, and they formed snake-like lines, and then one of the snakes came around and took its tail in its mouth, and he woke up and realized that benzene's a closed ring structure. And I think that his mind went there faster in a dream because the prefrontal wasn't as loudly telling him, no, molecules have to be straight lines. And almost all the scientific breakthroughs in dreams have that quality of thinking outside the box, of letting the associations go somewhere else. But I think even in your sort of literary creativity, that definitely just what the brain is doing allows for much more far-flung associations and much less the usual kind of logical tracks.
Somebody told me once, or maybe I read this, that you're most creative when your mind is a little looser, when you're conscious that it's a little looser. So almost in that meditative state, that Buddhist meditative state, now that we're here at the Rubin, I should throw that out. That sense of meditation where your mind is not as controlled, I guess, that you're talking about. And I often think of the creativity as being this lack of separate areas, that it's as though the connections, that there's looser borders, and they can go right from the other, so I'm not as confined. And that's what I mean by a kind of synesthesia, where these things get linked together, a sensory thing, a smell thing, and they all go into one gestalt. I had thought about this because of a person I met recently who's an autistic savant, Daniel Tammet, and we've been talking about synesthesia, and so he does it too as an autistic. He's overpowered by it. But then I started, when we were thinking about dreams, and I was saying, what is this gestalt that happens, with that dreams that allow it to come in that seem to be more open, but yet the meanings that does coalesce as some kind of meaning. I suppose something random. I mean, people have talked about that as random. And
I don't at all think dreams are random activity. The deep centers in the brain are firing, which seems to be what wakes the cortex up, because during the rest of sleep, our brain is much less active, and then these firings that start low down in the brain activate the cortex. But then there really seems to be a lot of meaningful activity going on in the cortex. It's not just processing the firings upward. And it's interesting you mentioned synesthesia, because that's something that's moderately rare as a waking experience, but a lot of people who don't experience that, tasting colors or hearing sounds, seeing sounds in waking will in dreams.
Yeah.
And I think that's just a more specific case of just how much broader the associations are in general in dreaming.
I see notes and colors, musical notes, but not in the same way I think that some people do, where they can actually hear all the notes where they have perfect pitch and they know. I can do it somewhat. I should tell you that I had this dream once where I dreamt hearing a certain piece by Chopin, and it was an etude. And I woke up hearing this, and it so happened a musician called up at the same time, a conductor, and I was saying I couldn't remember the name of the piece. And so I hummed it to him, and he told me, and he said, and the weird thing is you hummed it exactly on the key that it is in. So I thought there's something really wonderful about memory coming out in the dreams, a very specific memory of obviously having heard this this music before.
Yeah, and actually most people don't have a lot of auditory content at all in their dreams, much less music, but musicians do, and you seem to be very musical. I know you've been involved in
yeah, you know, and
right.
I always thought other people did this, which is when I hear music, say at the symphony, and I go to the symphony more often than I do the movies, but when I hear something, unless it's opera and it's very specific to the music, I always see a story. And I asked somebody, you know, I mean, what did you see when you heard this piece? And they're thinking, what are you talking about? And I always, from the time I was a kid playing the piano, I saw something. And there was always emotion and a visual thing. And it surprised me when I found out not everybody does that automatically.
Yeah, I think more artists do that awake than the average person, but then I think almost everyone does more yet of that in the dream. That one sensory modality generates another. Or one of the composers I interviewed for the Committee of Sleep, Shirish Karde, was telling me that he just occasionally has color associations to music as he hears it, and certainly when he hears music, he kind of automatically sees the score. When he looks at a score, he automatically hears it. I gather most musicians do, even though most of us wouldn't. But he says that in dreams, it's always happening when he dreams, a number of his pieces of music have started in dreams where he hears just the harmony or some part of it. But he says that he's hearing the music and he's seeing the notes floating around, and they're in colors that he associates with it. And in one dream, there was a flock of birds flying, and they were all the height on the staff that the notes would indicate, and they were flapping at the speed that indicated how long the piece. And I've seen his score for this piece that is drawn on a musical staff, but it's these bird shapes on there. And he's had some of his operas performed with the lighting changing in the colors that he saw in the dreams. So it's much more in his dreams, but it's still, even awake, he's got more of that than most people.
Can you learn in dreams? I mean, I know you've talked about problem solving, but what if I wanted to learn to have perfect pitch, or if I wanted to learn how to do something musically and I don't have that skill? Is it ever possible to learn something new?
Certainly, once in a while, people report that happening spontaneously. Oliver Sacks has this wonderful story in his book, A Leg to Stand On, about how when he had that terrible multiple fracture in his leg, he'd been given crutches in the hospital, and he really couldn't get the hang of walking on one leg and using the crutches very well. He still had a lot of pain in the multiple fractured one. And while he was still at the hospital, he napped and he had this dream, and he was sort of doing the right rhythm to use the crutch and his good leg properly. And he woke up and kind of realized he knew the feel of it and got up and used the crutches easily for the first time. And I've heard of people who wanted to learn a new dance step, having sort of watched it, but felt like they never got it right, and then doing it. And in the committee, I've got a story about the acrobat who first performed the double-double, which is a double forward somersault while doing a double side twist, all in the air and landing.
So it seems like it's mostly motor stuff.
What you did.
Yeah, I think
motor things where, especially if we've seen it or we have information about it, can come together that way. It's not a state in which you're going to I mean, for one thing, you're not getting any new sensory input from the outside during that state. So it's not a time you're going to be learning in the sense of memorizing something, but it seems at least to be able to take learning and put it together in some aha way sometimes.
Yeah. You know, I mean, speaking of this newness of experience or learning, the most intense emotional experience I have ever had was in a dream, and it does not come close to anything that I've had awake. And I heard it described once, this sort of sensation of what that was, by somebody actually in Burma, a monk, talking about what this level of meditation is. Again, this Buddhist stuff that's going on, and this isn't forced, believe me. The connection here being when you have this meditative state, you can have this oneness with whatever is out there, this sense of peace and happiness and joy and everything, and love. And that hit me so profoundly in a dream, and I thought, I don't know if I ever would have had that in waking life. And the image that was with it was my mother who had recently passed. And so that leads me to this thing. It seemed like in the committee there were some things having to do with people who might have been visited in dreams by other entities or other levels of consciousness, and I wondered, what you found.
Well, definitely in dream accounts in general, people often have powerful senses that either someone they know in waking life or a deceased person that they used to know, or just some famous person or person from history that they really kind of feel like that person is there. That can happen in any dream, but it also sometimes happens in these dreams where people are having some breakthrough or inspiration, and like this computer programmer I interviewed, Einstein would come and draw flow charts of
and
how
you don't
the
think it
program
really
should
was
go.
Einstein?
Well, Einstein wasn't even alive when this sort of computing was being developed. It's not like Einstein would have known anything about these, but he was the guy's.
Doesn't he keep learning, Einstein? Even when
I can't prove that it wasn't
in the dreaming state. Maybe.
Einstein's spirit. I tend to think it's another part of this man's conscious, but who knows? Definitely powerful figures that that represent that emotion or that have the potential to solve something that you can't or something do often show up as how some solution or inspiration occurs in a dream. Is some powerful figure who you feel like would know more or be likelier to give this advice or something is there and gives it the dream.
I've had that where it was somebody who gave me advice, and you could say it's always been within me, and then the symbolic person came to me and told me what I needed to know to move on, but I also still maintain this sense that it is some other consciousness. And one of them was I had a series of dreams when I was in my 20s, and a roommate of my husband and I had been murdered, and in a terrible, terrible way. And he would come to me at night and have these lessons. It seemed like they were lessons that happened quite often. And so one of the lessons had to do with my self-esteem. And he took me to this place. It was very magical, full of elephants. Elephants, not the kind that impregnates you, but elephants that fly, actually, and camels, and see how I can do this so easily. It just comes off. The animals that could fly in the most beautiful of locations. And he said, well, do you want to fly like these animals? And I thought, well, that's great. I'll do that. And I said, but wait a minute, I'm not dead, so I can't fly. And he said, it's okay, you can rent wings over there. And there was a little stand. There's a little stand there. It was 25 cents, real bargain. So I rented a pair of wings, and I jumped off, and I was flying, and it was great. And then all of a sudden I thought, wait a minute, 25-cent wings, and then I was plunging, and I was going to die. Then I said, but I was just flying just a second ago, and then I was flying again. And I did this back and forth for a number of times until I realized that it was my belief that I could fly that enabled me to fly. Now, thank God I don't believe that while I'm awake and jump off buildings. But what it was created such a cathartic effect of affecting my sense of own determination in how I went about life, to know that I had to stop this kind of thought that I couldn't do something, and just try that. As I think that as a result of that early dream, and another one in which the boogeyman, the typical thing, the boogeyman is chasing you, and your legs get full of cement, and you can't run, and you're seeing, and I heard my friend's voice say, "Turn around and look what's chasing you." No, he's going to kill me. He's going to turn me into, green slime. And he just said, "Turn around." And I turned around, and I saw it was a monster. But the minute I turned around, it was baffled. And then it slowly disappeared. And I heard my friend say, "You see, it's your fears that give power to these things to chase you. And if you turn around and face them, they won't chase you anymore." So they were examples of really powerful emotional dreams. Mm-hmm. I don't know whether you would call that creativity, but it was definitely a life-changing experience for me emotionally and how I went about my life.
Yeah, and I think it's creativity when we're solving personal problems too, and it's another example of that. Instead of just having that realization yourself within the dream, that someone else tells you that. I think that there's something about the dream state that makes us likely to, I'd say, project off things that are parts of ourselves onto someone else, although again, I can't prove it's not other things entering us from outside, but somehow, like, it's, you think of your friend as someone who'd give wise advice, or it's easier to process it when someone else is reassuring you, or something. That's just so common in dreams, that there's another character other than the representation of the dreamer that is actually voicing this.
Well, and I've thought about the possibility that person in there is really myself. As people say in narratives and fiction, when you're writing these things, you write your characters, or you're really acting out part of yourself, whether you know it or not. I don't quite believe that, because sometimes we create entities just for narrative purposes. But people always say that it's a reflection of something about oneself. So that this person, my friend who had died, I've considered, well, maybe it's me being my own guide telling me I have to do these things. But this person then came into a final dream and said, "Now I have to go on to do my stuff, you have to go on to do your stuff, and not going to have the dreams anymore." And I got really mad, and I said, "Wait a minute, these are my dreams, you don't get to go away." And he says, no, other things to do, but you're going to meet a woman named Rose, and she's going to be very influential to you in writing. She's going to help you with writing. And I knew of a Rose, but I thought, this person hates me. There's no way this person's going to help me with writing. But sure enough, about a year later, she started to write letters to me. And then she was a writer. And she started recommending things based on my letters to her, things I should read that were fiction, and eventually became very important to me, told me where I might submit stories to, giving me feedback on stories. And I look back and I think, well, how could it have been me who came up with this idea that this woman, Rose, would have helped me. And it was a very specific person that was in this dream. And I'd never met her before. So there's no reason why this woman would have known me and wanted to help me. And the reason why she hated me is that I was the messenger. I was the one who told her that her friend had been killed. So, of course, she hated me. But I'm one. I don't know whether you come across in your research others who feel that it's an inexplicable entity that provides the creativity. I mean, that they explain it that way, even though maybe that's not what's going on.
Oh, I mean, definitely across all kinds of cultures, there have been very specific beliefs that it's always coming from the gods or it's always coming from the ancestors, but just individuals definitely feel like there is some entity outside themselves that
like
appears.
The scientists? I mean, did any of the scientists feel that?
Fewer of them did, but sometimes, sometimes even And actually, there's a mathematician named Don Newman, who, again, after I'd written this book, so it's not in the book, I heard him on Nova on a show about John Nash, and he was talking about how he'd once been stuck on a math problem early in his career when he was a young mathematician at MIT. He'd been struggling with this problem and stuck on it. And so one night he dreamed that he was continuing to puzzle about the problem, and he ran into John Nash, who was already the rising star of MIT's math department. And he told Nash this problem that he was working on in the dream and asked Nash if he could solve it. And Nash explained a solution to him in the dream. And he woke up and he realized that was the solution. And he wrote up the paper and he wrote a footnote thanking John Nash for his help with this.
Did somebody tell John Nash?
Well, he told John Nash at the time. They were, they were colleagues in a not huge department, and they were friends. And so Newman kind of mentioned to me that he'd done. I called him up and asked him about it after seeing him on Nova immediately, and he kind of mentioned the footnote. But then I just happened to meet John Nash about 6 months later. I was seated next to him at a dinner party, and we were talking about these things. And he, by the way, has never had a problem-solving dream. But he knew of most of the mathematical examples I did, and he, of course, knew of Newman's. And he said, oh, yeah, it was so funny. He was so grateful. He was just thanking me for days and days after that. And, it was his dream, but he said, he just kept saying, I couldn't have done that. I couldn't have done that.
So he didn't say he went into the...
So he almost seemed to believe it was just this living friend of his that somehow did something in his dream. Again, I tend to see it as something about the Nash figure being able to tap. He was obviously very mathematically talented himself, Newman. But who knows? But yes, people certainly experience it that way, although I tend to interpret it more like you already knew this Rose person at least a little bit, even though she hated you because you'd been the messenger. You'd obviously shared a friend, and there was some potential for you guys to be friends. And the you that thinks, oh, she hates me because...
No, she told me she hated me. I know she did. She admitted that she found it very strange.
But I was going to say, might not be the only part of you that had any perceptions about her, that some part of your mind might have been more able to see that she could get past that and do this other thing. But who knows?
I didn't know she was a writer. It was, I do strongly attribute some things that I can't explain that comes to me in my dreams. And if we were to talk about loose borders where sensory, memory, problem solving, and all of those come together, or physical aspects, if they all come together unbuffered, then I feel that if there is a consciousness out there that there's a portal that they can go through as well. It's sort of like the gate is up, and everything can go in and out freely. I mean, that intuitively is what it feels like to me. Not, with dreams, that also what happens with creativity. There's a state of, that sleepiness. People talk about that sleepy meditative state.
Sort of hypnagogic is what we call it, as if you're falling, in the act of falling asleep. But there are all kinds of names for that.
Sort of. I do that a lot. Then I sit there and I'm writing, and it's like I nearly fall off my chair. But I think that's just called being tired and bored with what I'm writing, actually. So the other, when we talk about so much that's meaningful in dreams. And I don't think it's just flotsam and jetsam kind of stuff floating by in a river of garbage that's happened. And I was mentioning to Deirdre, the other day that I have seizures. And seizures, I have one kind of seizure that creates imagery. And it could be smell, it can be sensory imagery. It could be smell combined with seeing something. some visual things. But what happens with those that burst of electrical activity that produces this stuff is meaningless to me. I mean, I have no reaction to it. It is like I turned on a TV set and there's some boring TV program on there that I have no interest in. I have no emotional response to. And some of the same images come up, so it makes me feel that there are parts of the brain that emit stuff, but then do seem to be meaningless, but somehow, you know, like that random stuff people talk about.
Yeah, and as soon as you mentioned that, I thought that was such a great counterexample to there definitely are still in my profession people that feel like dreams are meaningless, are random activity in the brain, and yet the content doesn't look random. I mean, when you collect dreams, certainly some of them are trivial. A lot of our waking thinking is pretty trivial and unimportant and not creating or solving anything. And lots of dreams are boring and dull and repetitive in that sense. But in the sort of totally random, no meaning to this, they just aren't. When you study problem-solving dreams, there are really complex activities going on and sometimes getting solved in dreams, whereas seizures really are what some people are trying to argue dreams are. They're pretty much random activity in the brain. And from an evolutionary standpoint, anything that we all do a lot of, and all mammals have REM sleep, and all humans report dreams, probably has a pretty big adaptive value. That's just, since Darwin, a thing that's pretty accepted in science. Whereas seizures are not things that happen to most people. They're probably, in an evolutionary sense, selected against. They're a disorder in the brain, and so you wouldn't expect them to have an adaptive function. Now, I know seizures can lead to creative products. Some artists have woken up and painted an image that occurs in a seizure, but it's not the same thing as it coming up with an insight or it's more like what our waking mind might take from a seizure image. And it can be emotional if the seizure is down around the amygdala or some area associated with emotion. It can be very emotional, but it still doesn't seem new, creative, etc. It is more genuinely random. So I really
just
like
so you know what
example.
An example is, and I have a feeling minor temporal lobe seizures, and there must be something in that area with my memory, so it's just the same repetitive image that comes up. It doesn't have anything to do with I'm feeling that day or emotions or what's happened that day. And so one of the most typical image that would happen is I'd wake up and I would see an odometer that was brightly lit, and the numbers are spinning, not sequentially, but they're sort of like this, and then the numbers start to decay. And I'm trying to, understand, why do I keep having this image? It means nothing to me, but it's the same image over and over again. And there were some, similarly, the same figures that would show up like just like a bad photograph. The same thing, so it just seemed like it wasn't the same kind of productive, kind of fluid dream state. It was just like a photograph coming up, something meaningless that came up just out of whatever that area is that fires that same image over and over again in my brain. I just, these states of consciousness and unconscious thinking that happen, or is it? Are dreams, do you still call that unconscious thinking?
Well, the analysts say it's coming from the unconscious, but really by most psychological definitions, if you're having an experience of it, a sort of narrative awareness of it, it's not unconscious.
As opposed to
I
if you
think
have
it's
the
more
coma
that some other parts of our mind that are not usually in our little narrow spotlight of consciousness are getting spotlighted and are conscious in the dreaming state.
Have there ever been PET scans done of people dreaming certain dreams and remembering them, and then also doing creative things to show that there might be similar things firing in the brain?
Well, there's a lot of brain imaging, but PET and some of the technologies, you inject the radioactivity of the PET scan, and you need to PET scan a certain amount after, and you don't go into REM for 90 minutes. So that's not a good technology for it. People have tried that a little.
Yeah.
Most of the brain imaging is from either electrical activity or magnetic activity of the brain. But some of that we can now put like at least 128 electrodes all around the brain and construct a very 3D image. So it's actually of electrical activity rather than PET scans are showing glucose utilization. But it's usually the electrical per se, or you can do magnetic interference and get a 3D. So in a, not PET scans much, but in a sense, what you're asking about.
So they can do that. Have they done studies where they do it for the creativity aspects and the dreaming, or?
Well, another problem with all this is people can't sort of signal out, you don't know exactly when this particular aspect of a dream is occurring.
Unless you can control your dreams.
But exactly, what there has been the most done on are lucid dreams, where someone knows they're dreaming while they're dreaming. They can then eye signal that right now they're doing a particular thing in the dream. So there have been some studies on lucid dreams and looking at, most of the studies are just looking at what brain activity looks like during dreams in general. This more active visual cortex, less active prefrontal area kind of things. But there's some that shows that just like awake, if you make yourself do math in your dream and you're signaling, now I'm doing that math problem we agreed on, that indeed the same areas relate.
Maybe you should just get lucid dreamers for this study. I do lucid dreaming, but it's very, I don't have a broad repertoire. Sometimes a lot of it has to do with plane crashes, and that I can steer the plane. And I can say to myself, is this a dream or is this, and then I decide, no, it's a dream, and I can control where the plane goes. A real common one is flying, and one of my favorite is that when I'm facing some stairs going down or any kind of incline, I remember, oh, there's that dream. I can fly down just holding the banister and go down. And the other one is I can go above people. Usually it has to be a ceiling like this, because if you start to fly and you have a low ceiling, then you kind of bump into things. But I can actually go, and then when I get going and then I can start moving. But I always know I have this ability in these dreams when I do want to fly. And I've had some control over making some outcomes happen. And one of the ways I learned to do that was that if I didn't like a dream and I could remember that I was dreaming, that I could look down at my feet, and when I looked up, I would be somewhere else. So it was more like the segue, just an abrupt, just like in a narrative, in the white space and you have little cross hatches, it's like you're going to the next, a jump in the scene in a narrative, and that's kind of what happens there. So.
Yeah, once you're lucid in a dream, you can just do all kinds of things with that. You can get out of a situation you want out of, but on the other hand, the monsters don't necessarily have to be scary once you know it's a dream monster. It doesn't have to shrink down or go away. It just, it's dream monster, and it can't hurt you, and it's interesting to interact with it. So lucid dreams are wonderful. They're somewhat harder to achieve than just influencing your dreams in other ways. But most people do find if they really work at it a while, they can.